The first knock came at 6:45 a.m., sharp and aggressive, like someone was trying to kick the door down with their knuckles. I knew before I even peeled myself out of bed that it could only mean one thing: Karen Whitmore. In Harmony Heights, unexpected knocks weren't random, they were warnings. Warnings that your grass was half an inch too tall, that your holiday lights were visually disruptive, or, God forbid, that your American flag was flying at a slightly improper angle. Harmony Heights looked like a postcard: emerald lawns, pristine driveways, identical beige houses lined up like obedient soldiers, but under the surface, it was a dictatorship ruled by the HOA, with Queen Karen sitting on her plastic lawn throne. I stumbled to the door, already bracing for whatever nonsense she was about to unleash. Sure enough, there she stood, clipboard in hand, lips pursed so tightly I wondered if she even had a mouth. Behind her, the sun was just starting to bleach the sky a pale blue, highlighting every perfectly trimmed hedge and identical mailbox that Karen probably inspected each morning like a drill sergeant. "We need to address a serious violation," she snapped, skipping all greetings like they were against HOA regulations too. I barely held back a groan. "It's too early for this, Karen," I muttered, rubbing my face. But she shoved a folded piece of paper at me anyway, like she was serving a court summons. It wasn't about me. It was about my brother David, who, after 12 grueling years in the army, had just moved in with me while adjusting back to civilian life. David wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. All he did yesterday was step out to grab a cup of coffee, wearing his old camouflage pants. And now, according to Karen, he was disrupting the visual harmony of Harmony Heights. Her exact words. "Military attire is prohibited under HOA Clause 14b, Karen stated, voice dripping with false concern. "We must preserve a non-threatening aesthetic." I stared at her. I honestly thought she was joking. When I realized she wasn't, a slow, dangerous smile crept across my face. Karen had no idea the storm she had just unleashed. I unfolded the paper she thrust at me and skimmed it, still half asleep and fully irritated. The language was ridiculous. All stiff, legal-sounding jargon trying to make something as harmless as camouflage pants sound like a federal offense. According to this official notice, military clothing was categorized as intimidating attire and was deemed unacceptable within the community visual standards. Failure to comply would result in fines, possible legal action, and, get this, mandatory review by the HOA Disciplinary Committee. "Karen," I said slowly, folding the paper back up and tucking it into my back pocket. "You're serious about this?" She straightened her already rigid spine. "Deadly serious. We must maintain order, John. Harmony depends on it." I stared at her, at the desperation in her eyes to control something, anything, and felt a slow burn ignite in my chest. This wasn't about visual standards. It wasn't about Camo. It was about power. And David, just by existing in a way she didn't approve of, had threatened her illusion of control. "Look," I said, trying for diplomacy. "My brother just got back from serving overseas. He's not trying to intimidate anyone. He's just living." Karen's lips curled slightly, like she'd just bitten into something rotten. "The rules apply to everyone," she said, her tone curt and final. Without another word, she spun on her heel and marched back down the walkway, her kitten heels stabbing angry little holes in the lawn. I closed the door and leaned my forehead against it for a moment, letting out a long sigh. From the kitchen, I heard the familiar clink of a coffee mug. David was up. He stood there, mug in hand, wearing a gray t-shirt and athletic shorts, the least offensive outfit imaginable, but there was already a wary look in his eyes. "Problem?" he asked, voice low and even. I held up the notice. "You, apparently," I said, tossing it onto the counter. David took one glance at the letter and set his coffee down slowly. His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking just beneath the skin. 12 years in the military had taught him to stay calm under pressure, but I knew him well enough to recognize when a fuse had been lit. "They're fining me for wearing camo?" he asked, voice flat. I nodded. Apparently you're a one-man threat to suburban harmony. For a moment, David said nothing. Then a slow, mischievous grin spread across his face. The kind of grin that usually meant something very bad, and very entertaining, was about to happen. If they want a show, he said, draining the rest of his coffee, then that's exactly what they're going to get. And just like that, the battle lines were drawn. The next morning, Harmony Heights woke to the sound of war, or at least, that's what Karen probably thought. David had risen before dawn. I found him in the living room, methodically lacing up a pair of scuffed tactical boots, his old army rucksack slung over one shoulder, and the piece de resistance, a perfectly pressed set of military fatigues, complete with a name patch, division insignia, and even a matching beret. "You're seriously doing this?" I asked, half laughing, half horrified. David just grinned. "If they want to be intimidated, I might as well give them something worth being intimidated about." By the time the first sleepy retirees waddled out to retrieve their newspapers, David was already in the driveway, polishing the hood of my beat-up old Jeep with all the casualness of a man watering his lawn. Neighbors peeked through their curtains like spies in a bad Cold War movie. Mrs. Henderson, a frail woman who still hand-delivered welcome baskets to new residents, nearly dropped her basket of muffins when she saw him. Mr. Peterson, the militant gardener 3 doors down, stopped trimming his bushes mid-snip, his jaw slack. Even the teenage skateboarders, normally oblivious to everything but their phones, slowed down, wide-eyed. And then came Karen. She stormed across her lawn, clutching her cell phone like it was a holy relic, her face already flushing that signature HOA red. She didn't bother knocking this time. She marched right up to David, heels clicking furiously against the pavement. "This is deliberate provocation," she hissed. David turned slowly, giving her a calm, measured look that only made her angrier. "Morning," he said, tipping his beret with mock politeness. "You are in violation of the HOA dress code," she snapped, jabbing a perfectly manicured finger at his chest. David looked down at himself, as if seeing the uniform for the first time. "Huh," he said thoughtfully. "You know, when I wore this in Kandahar, nobody seemed to mind." Karen bristled, momentarily thrown off balance. "You're upsetting the residents," she said, regaining her footing. "You're creating an unsafe environment." David raised an eyebrow. "Unsafe?" he echoed. "I spent 12 years keeping environments safe. You're welcome, by the way." It was at that exact moment that Mr. Henderson, a neighbor who rarely said more than 2 words to anyone, leaned over his fence and called out, "Thank you for your service, son!" David gave him a crisp salute. Karen's nostrils flared so hard I thought she might actually lift off the ground like an angry balloon. "You'll be fine for this," she barked. "I'll see to it personally." David just smiled serenely. "Better make it a big fine," he said, "because I'm planning to wear my dress blues tomorrow." Karen's mouth opened and closed, speechless for once. She spun on her heel and stormed away, nearly tripping over a lawn gnome in her rage. The next day was even better. David made good on his promise. At precisely 9 a.m., he strutted down the street in full ceremonial dress uniform, shining shoes, polished medals, everything, like he was leading a 4th of July parade. He carried the morning paper tucked under one arm and waved cheerfully at every neighbor he passed. People started coming out just to watch. A few clapped. One older gentleman even stood at attention and saluted as David walked by. Karen, meanwhile, was practically vibrating with fury on her front porch, frantically snapping photos with her phone like she was gathering evidence for an impending war crimes tribunal. By the 3rd day, David escalated further. He set up a small folding table in the front yard and began offering free, Camo appreciation stickers to anyone who wanted one. Kids loved it. Several houses proudly slapped the stickers on their mailboxes. Karen lost her mind. She called an emergency HOA meeting that evening, demanding new regulations banning military attire, camo patterns, and anything paramilitary adjacent. The room was tense, board members shifting uncomfortably under her tirade. It didn't help that David attended the meeting, in uniform, of course, and politely raised his hand after every one of Karen's rants. "Point of clarification," he'd say. "Is the HOA now claiming that honoring military service is against community standards?" Silence. Awkward shifting. A few sympathetic coughs. Karen's face grew redder by the second, but she couldn't seem to rally the board like she once did. Too many people were starting to see her behavior for what it really was: petty, vindictive, and downright un-American. After the meeting, David and I sat on the porch, sipping cold beers and watching the sun dip low over the cookie-cutter rooftops. The neighborhood felt different. Lighter somehow. "You realize she's not going to stop," I said, tipping my bottle toward Karen's house, where she could be seen pacing behind her windows. David smiled lazily, propping his boots up on the porch railing. "I'm counting on it." Because David wasn't just wearing a uniform. He was making a point. And Karen, for the first time in a long time, was losing. If you think David handled it like a boss, hit that like button. 2 days later, the letter arrived. A thick, self-important envelope stamped with the Harmony Heights HOA seal in shiny gold foil. Karen had spared no expense making sure it looked as official and intimidating as possible. David plucked it from the mailbox, whistling as he flipped it open with a pocket knife. I watched from the porch, sipping coffee, already guessing what was inside. He unfolded the document, scanned it briefly, and let out a low chuckle. Then he handed it to me. The HOA was fining David $250 a day for non-compliance with visual standards, and threatened further legal action, up to and including forced removal proceedings, if he did not immediately cease wearing military attire in the neighborhood. I blinked at the paper, stunned by both the stupidity and the audacity. "She's actually serious," I muttered. David just smiled that slow, dangerous smile again. "The more serious she gets," he said, "the harder she's going to fall." That night David got to work. First, he pulled out his old army laptop, battered but still functional, and began digging through military housing rights online. I watched as he navigated government websites, making a few phone calls to former commanders and old Army legal contacts. By midnight he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a look of absolute satisfaction on his face. "I've got her," he said. The next morning, armed with a thick folder of documents, David marched straight into the HOA office. Karen was there, of course, perched behind the front desk like a vulture guarding a carcass. She sneered the moment she saw him. "Mr. Carter. Here to pay your fines, I assume?" David dropped the folder onto the counter with a loud thud. "Actually," he said, his voice calm and crisp, "I'm here to inform you that your fines, and your threats, are in direct violation of federal law." Karen blinked. "Excuse me?" David flipped open the top document. "According to the Service Members Civil Relief Act," he said, tapping the highlighted section, "it's illegal for HOAs to discriminate against active or former military personnel in housing-related matters, including dress codes that target military attire." Karen's lips thinned to a bloodless line. "Furthermore," David continued smoothly, "your actions could constitute harassment of a protected class. That carries some very interesting legal consequences, for both the HOA and you personally." For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Karen faltered. I could see the cracks forming in her perfectly constructed mask of authority. "You're bluffing," she snapped, but there was a waver in her voice now. David smiled coldly. "Am I?" He pulled out his phone, opened an email, and showed her the header. Base Legal Office, Housing Rights Division. They had reviewed the situation. They were very interested. They were even more interested after David mentioned there might be misuse of HOA funds involved. Karen paled. "You wouldn't," she whispered. David leaned closer, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "You escalated this, Karen. I'm just following your lead." By noon, panic had rippled through the HOA board. Karen frantically called an emergency meeting to review the complaint. Board members shuffled into the stuffy conference room, uneasy and tight-lipped. David and I attended, of course. This time, David wore his most immaculate uniform yet, dress blues, polished to mirror shine, every ribbon and medal perfectly aligned. Karen opened the meeting with a tremulous voice. Mr. Carter has raised concerns about the legality of certain enforcement actions, she said, trying to sound formal but failing miserably. We will now reconsider our previous notices. David let her squirm for a full 30 seconds before standing up. I have a few additional concerns, he said. Specifically, about the HOA's financial records. The room stiffened. Karen went rigid. This is irrelevant, she snapped. David arched an eyebrow. Is it? Because according to public records, the HOA landscaping budget doubled this year, yet the maintenance company reports no increased services. He let that hang in the air like a live grenade. The other board members started whispering furiously among themselves. Susan, Karen's loyal sidekick, looked especially pale. I move, Mrs. Rodriguez said suddenly, her voice clear and shaking only slightly, that we drop all fines and enforcement actions against Mr. Carter immediately. I second, Mr. Henderson croaked. Karen slammed her clipboard onto the table. You can't be serious. We are a lawful governing body. David smiled. One that's about to find itself in federal court if you don't clean up your act. The vote wasn't even close. The board voted unanimously to rescind all actions against David, issue a formal apology, and, perhaps most deliciously, open an independent audit into HOA finances. Karen sat there, trembling with rage, as her little empire crumbled around her. As David and I walked out of the meeting room, the late afternoon sun spilling golden light across the manicured lawns, I couldn't help but laugh. You just nuked the whole HOA, I said. David shrugged. She drew first blood. Quick poll, comment 1 if you think David was absolutely right, or 2 if you would have handled it even harder. Karen's defeat at the HOA meeting wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. Within 48 hours, whispers started spreading through Harmony Heights like wildfire. Neighbors who had once dutifully bowed to Karen's rules were now talking, and not just about David's uniform. They were talking about the money. Where had the extra landscaping fees gone? Why had the clubhouse renovation fund dried up even though no renovations had actually been done? Why had Karen and Susan both shown up last month in brand new SUVs? David didn't stop at winning the meeting. He filed a formal complaint with the county auditor's office, citing financial irregularities in the HOA's public disclosures. A few phone calls to some retired neighbors, one a former IRS agent, another a board lawyer, and suddenly there was a full-blown community investigation underway. Karen's perfect kingdom was crumbling faster than a sandcastle in a hurricane. 3 weeks later, the auditors arrived. Clipboards, suits, stern expressions. They didn't even bother hiding their disdain for the mess they were stepping into. They set up shop in the HOA office, combing through files, questioning board members, reviewing every payment and contract. Karen tried to play it cool. She smiled too much. She offered coffee. She even baked cookies. It didn't work. By the second day, David and I saw the auditors carrying out boxes of financial records, most of them looking more chaotic than a teenager's bedroom. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks, pretending to water their lawns or check their mail, all eager to catch a glimpse of the action. Rumors flew faster than Karen could stomp them out. $50,000 missing from the clubhouse fund, whispered Mrs. Henderson one evening, passing by with her dog. She hired her cousin's landscaping company and overbilled, muttered Mr. Peterson the next morning. The final nail came a week later when the auditors posted an official notice on the HOA bulletin board. Pending legal review of financial misconduct. Current HOA leadership suspended pending investigation. The day the notice went up, David and I sat on the porch, watching the chaos unfold. Karen's house, once pristine and smugly immaculate, now looked tired. The flowers were wilting. The hedges were growing wild. It was as if the universe itself had decided to stop obeying her. Moving trucks pulled up 2 days later. Karen stormed around the yard, barking orders at the movers, her face locked in a permanent scowl. Susan was nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it she had quietly put her house up for sale a week earlier and fled to a neighboring town. I couldn't resist. As Karen stomped past, I raised my coffee mug in a lazy salute. David, ever the professional, simply nodded once, the faintest ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Karen glared daggers at us, but there was no fight left. Not anymore. She loaded the last box into the truck, slammed the door shut, and without so much as a glance back, she was gone. Later that evening, the neighborhood gathered in the cul-de-sac for an impromptu celebration. It wasn't officially called a party. Harmony Heights still had some sense of decorum left, but grills were fired up, coolers were popped open, and music floated through the air. Laughter, real and unrestrained, echoed between the houses. People who had barely spoken for years now traded war stories about Karen's reign of terror. The time she finds someone for planting non-approved flowers. The time she banned Halloween decorations because they promoted paganism. The time she demanded a neighbor remove their American flag because it was too large. One by one, they laughed, toasted, and let the tension of years melt away. David, in his usual laid-back way, flipped burgers and handed out cold beers like he'd lived there forever. Nobody cared about the camo pants anymore. If anything, a few people even showed up wearing their own versions, old army jackets, camouflage hats, in silent tribute. Mr. Henderson raised a toast as the sun dipped low behind the rooftops. To David Carter, he said loudly. The man who reminded us what real service looks like. A cheer went up, and David, embarrassed but grinning, lifted his beer. I leaned over and nudged him. Not bad for your first couple months back in civilian life, huh? David chuckled. Not bad at all. Later, as we sat on the porch watching the last of the party wind down, David stretched his legs out and sighed contentedly. You know, he said, staring up at the stars, I fought insurgents tougher than Karen. I laughed. I think you just fought the ultimate battle of petty suburbia. And you won. He smiled. For now, he said. You know there's always another one lurking somewhere. I nodded. Yeah. But for tonight, we've got peace. And for the first time in a long, long while, Harmony Heights finally lived up to its name. Know someone dealing with their own Karen? Share this story with them. They'll love it. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter somehow. The invisible tension that had wrapped around Harmony Heights for years had finally lifted, like a stubborn fog finally burned away by the sun. David and I sipped our coffee on the porch, watching as neighbors walked their dogs without glancing nervously over their shoulders, as kids rode their bikes without fear of violating some unwritten, quiet hours rule. Even the air smelled sweeter. Or maybe that was just the absence of Karen's passive-aggressive perfume cloud drifting across the lawns. Later that afternoon, a few neighbors swung by, first Mrs. Henderson, then Mr. Peterson, then a slow but steady trickle of people, and someone suggested a proper barbecue. Not a stuffy, HOA-sanctioned, approved foods only event, but a real, honest gathering. No sign-up sheets. No permission slips. Just grills, laughter, and freedom. By sunset, the cul-de-sac was alive again. David manned the grill like a general commanding a battlefield, flipping burgers and ribs with expert precision. Kids darted between lawn chairs and folding tables, their squeals of joy unrestrained. Old neighbors swapped stories, clinking beer bottles together and laughing until their faces hurt. Someone even brought out a portable speaker, blasting old rock classics that Karen would have absolutely hated. At one point, Mr. Henderson, still wearing his army baseball cap, pulled David aside and handed him a folded American flag. Just a little thank you, he said gruffly, voice thick with emotion. David, not usually one for sentiment, stood a little straighter as he accepted it. As the sky darkened and fireflies began to wink across the lawns, I looked around and realized something profound. This wasn't just a party. It was a reclamation. Harmony Heights was finally living up to its name, not because of a set of arbitrary rules, but because people had taken their community back. I nudged David, who was watching the kids race each other down the street. "You started something, you know," I said. He smiled, a real, easy smile, the kind he hadn't worn since coming home. "Good," he said. "It's about damn time." And for the first time in a long, long while, we sat back, breathed in the sweet evening air, and let ourselves believe that, maybe, just maybe, this peace would last. Real community isn't built by rules, it's built by people. Drop a quick flex biceps in the comments if you agree. The days that followed settled into a rhythm we hadn't known for years. Without Karen's constant surveillance, Harmony Heights blossomed into something it had always pretended to be but never quite achieved, a true community. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now stopped to chat at mailboxes. Kids organized pick-up basketball games in the cul-de-sac. Porches, once sterile and regulation-approved, bloomed with bright flowers, colorful wind chimes, and unapologetically unique decorations. For the first time, people weren't just living next to each other, they were living with each other. David fit right in. Whether it was helping Mr. Peterson fix a broken fence, teaching the neighborhood kids basic first aid skills, or swapping barbecue recipes with Mrs. Rodriguez, he became more than just the guy in camo. He became the heartbeat of the street. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the rooftops, I turned to him. "You ever miss it?" I asked. He didn't have to ask what I meant: the uniform, the deployments, the fight. David thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Not really," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Fighting for something matters. Doesn't matter where." I nodded, understanding more than I could put into words. Because in the end, Harmony Heights hadn't been saved by rules or regulations. It had been saved by the stubborn courage of people who refused to be bullied, and by a soldier who knew that some battles are worth fighting, even if they take place on perfectly manicured lawns. And for now, at least, peace had truly come home. Love seeing justice served? Subscribe now for more real stories just like this one. At its core, this story isn't just about a petty HOA battle, it's about standing up against injustice, no matter how small or familiar it may seem. It reminds us that real change doesn't always come from grand gestures or sweeping movements. Sometimes it starts with one person refusing to back down, even when the odds, or the rules, seem stacked against them. David's quiet courage shows that defending dignity, community, and respect matters just as much at home as it does on distant battlefields. His fight wasn't fueled by pride or rebellion. It was fueled by the belief that no one should be bullied into submission, not by power-hungry individuals or by broken systems hiding behind policy. In our everyday lives, it's easy to feel powerless in the face of unfairness. But this story reminds us, when we stand firm with integrity, know our rights, and support each other, we can restore not just fairness, but true community. Sometimes the greatest battles are fought not overseas, but right on our own front lawns, and they are no less worthy of courage.